The brutal 1954 drought that broke farms, families, and the beating heart of rural Texas. Chapter 1. The brutal 1954 drought that broke farms, families, and the beating heart of rural Texas began not with a warning, but with silence. The kind of silence that settles over a land when the sky forgets how to weep. In the spring of that year, the people of West Texas looked upward and waited. They waited for clouds that never gathered. They waited for rain that never fell. They waited until waiting itself became a way of life, and then, slowly, a way of dying. Picture a morning in early March. The sun rises over the flatlands near Lubbock, casting long shadows across fields that should be green with winter wheat. Instead, the earth is cracked and pale, like the skin of an old man who has worked too long under an unforgiving sun. A farmer named Harold Dawson stands at the edge of his property, his boots sinking slightly into dust that was once rich, dark soil. He holds a handful of dirt and lets it slip through his fingers. It does not clump, it does not hold moisture. It simply falls, like sand through an hourglass measuring the end of everything he has built. Harold is 43 years old. He inherited this land from his father, who cleared it with his own hands in 1919. 3 generations of Dawsons have planted cotton and sorghum in these fields. 3 generations have watched the seasons turn, have trusted the rhythm of rain and sun, have believed in the promise of the land. But now, standing in the pale light of a March morning, Harold feels that promise breaking apart like the soil beneath his feet. His wife Eleanor watches him from the kitchen window. She has been watching him more often lately, noting the way his shoulders have begun to curve inward, the way he stares at the horizon, as if searching for something that has already disappeared. She knows what he is thinking. She knows because she is thinking it too. How long can they hold on? How long before the bank comes calling? How long before they have to tell their children that the only home they have ever known is no longer theirs? Across the county, similar scenes unfold. In the small town of Sweetwater, a rancher named George Whitfield walks among his cattle. The animals are thin, their ribs visible beneath hides that have lost their shine. The grazing land that once sustained 300 head can barely feed 50 now. George has already sold half his herd at prices so low they barely covered the cost of transport. He sold them because there was no grass left to eat, no water left to drink. He sold them because watching them starve was worse than watching them go. The drought of 1954 did not arrive suddenly. It crept in like a thief, stealing a little more each day, until there was almost nothing left to take. The first signs appeared in 1950, when rainfall dropped below normal for the second consecutive year. By 1951, the shortfall had become a pattern. By 1952, the pattern had become a crisis, and by 1954, the crisis had become a catastrophe that would reshape the landscape of Texas and the lives of everyone who called it home. The numbers tell part of the story. In a normal year, the Texas Panhandle receives between 18 and 20 inches of rain. In 1954, some areas received less than 6. Lakes that had sustained communities for decades shrank to muddy puddles. Rivers that had flowed since before memory dried to trickles, then to nothing at all. The Brazos River, which had carved its path through the heart of Texas for millennia, slowed to a crawl. In some stretches, a person could walk across its bed without wetting their ankles, but numbers cannot capture what it felt like to live through those days. They cannot describe the taste of dust that coated every meal, no matter how carefully Eleanor Dawson covered the dishes. They cannot convey the sound of cattle lowing in distress, their voices carrying across the empty plains like a mournful chorus. They cannot express the weight of despair that settled over communities where hope had always been as abundant as the land itself. In the town of Big Spring, a schoolteacher named Martha Keller taught her students about the water cycle. She drew diagrams on the chalkboard showing how water evaporated from the oceans, formed clouds, and fell as rain. The children listened politely, but their eyes held questions she could not answer. If water always comes back, they seemed to ask, why has it forgotten us? Martha had no response. She had lived in West Texas all her life, had seen dry spells and hard times, but nothing like this. Nothing that made the very concept of rain seem like a fairy tale told to comfort the young. The drought affected everyone, but it did not affect everyone equally. Small farmers like Harold Dawson, who operated on thin margins and depended on each season's crop to pay the next season's bills, faced ruin first. They did not have reserves to draw upon, did not have the capital to drill deeper wells or buy expensive feed for their livestock. They had only their land, their labor, and their faith. And as the months passed without rain, faith alone was not enough to keep the creditors at bay. Larger operations had more resources, but they too felt the squeeze. The King Ranch, one of the largest in the state, lost thousands of cattle. Corporate farms that had seemed invincible found their profits evaporating along with the water. The drought was an equalizer in that sense, reminding everyone that nature does not respect bank balances or property lines. When the rain stops, it stops for everyone. The effects rippled outward from the farms and ranches into the towns and cities. Businesses that depended on agricultural trade saw their customers disappear. Feed stores had nothing to sell because there was nothing to feed. Equipment dealers watched their inventory gather dust because no one was buying tractors for fields that could not be planted. Banks that had extended credit in good times now faced a wave of defaults that threatened their own survival. In Amarillo, a banker named Robert Chen sat in his office reviewing loan files. Each folder represented a family, a story, a dream that was now at risk of ending. Robert had grown up on a farm himself, had worked the fields as a boy before pursuing education and a different path. He understood what these families were going through in a way that pure city bankers could not. But understanding did not change the mathematics. The bank had obligations to its depositors, its shareholders, its own survival. He could delay, he could negotiate, he could offer extensions, but he could not make it rain. And without rain, the equations would not balance no matter how many times he recalculated them. The human cost accumulated day by day, week by week. Marriages strained under the pressure of constant worry. Parents lay awake at night wondering how they would feed their children, how they would explain that everything they had worked for might be lost. Children sensed the tension, even when adults tried to shield them, grew quieter, more watchful, old before their time. The drought was not just killing crops and cattle. It was killing something inside the people who endured it, some essential optimism that had always been part of life in this hard and beautiful land. And yet, even in the darkest days, there were moments of grace. Neighbors helped neighbors, sharing what little they had. Churches organized relief efforts, collecting food and clothing for families who had lost everything. Communities came together in ways they had not since the trials of earlier decades, remembering that survival in this country had always depended on mutual aid. The drought revealed the worst in some, as hard times always do, but it also revealed the best in many more. Harold Dawson stood at the edge of his field as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed almost cruel in their beauty. The land stretched out before him, cracked and waiting, patient as it had been patient for millions of years before any human walked its surface. He did not know what the coming months would bring. He did not know if his farm would survive, if his family would have to join the exodus of refugees fleeing to cities where they would seek work in factories and offices, far from the only life they had ever known. But he knew he would not give up without a fight. He knew that the same stubbornness that had brought his grandfather to this land, that had sustained his father through previous hardships, ran in his veins as well. He would plant when planting seemed hopeless. He would wait when waiting seemed foolish. He would believe in the rain even when the sky mocked his belief with endless, cloudless blue. The drought of 1954 was not the first to strike Texas, and it would not be the last. But for those who lived through it, it became a marker, a before and after that divided their lives into two unequal parts. Before, there had been certainty, or at least the illusion of certainty. After, there was only the knowledge that the land they loved could turn against them, that the sky they trusted could betray them, that everything they built could be swept away by forces beyond their control. This is the story of that drought, of the people who endured it, the communities that were transformed by it, the lessons that were learned and sometimes forgotten. It is a story of loss and resilience, of despair and hope, of the human spirit tested by nature at its most unforgiving. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. These stories of human endurance deserve to be remembered and shared, and by subscribing, you become part of a community dedicated to honoring those who faced impossible odds with courage and dignity. Chapter 2. The summer of 1954 arrived like a punishment. Temperatures that normally pushed into the 90s soared past 100 day after day, week after week, until the very air seemed to shimmer with malevolence. The sun rose each morning as a white disk in a bleached sky, climbing to its zenith with pitiless regularity, baking the land until the earth itself seemed to cry out for mercy. In the town of Midland, the thermometer outside the First National Bank became a grim attraction. People would gather in the mornings to see how high it would climb, their faces reflecting a mixture of resignation and disbelief. 102, 105, 108. Each new record seemed impossible, until the next day proved that impossibility was just another word for what had not happened yet. The heat killed directly and indirectly. Elderly residents who had survived decades of Texas summers succumbed to the relentless assault on their bodies. Children playing outside collapsed from heat stroke before their parents could call them in. Workers in the fields dropped where they stood, their bodies unable to cool themselves despite the sweat that poured from every pore. The hospitals filled with cases of heat exhaustion, dehydration, heat-related ailments that overwhelmed the medical staff. But the heat's greatest violence was reserved for the land itself. Whatever moisture remained in the soil evaporated into the merciless sky. Crops that had somehow survived the spring withered and died within weeks. Cotton plants that should have stood waist-high remained stunted, their leaves curling inward as if trying to protect themselves from the sun. Cornstalks turned brown and brittle, rattling in the hot wind like the bones of dead things. On the Dawson farm, Harold worked from before dawn until after dark, trying to save what could be saved. He had rigged a system of pipes from his well to irrigate the most promising sections of his cotton field, but the well was producing less water each day. The water table was dropping as farmers across the region drew from the same diminishing underground reserves. What had seemed like an inexhaustible resource was revealing its limits. Eleanor helped where she could, tending the kitchen garden that provided vegetables for the family table. But even with careful watering, the plants struggled. Tomatoes that should have been large and red remained small and pale. Beans produced pods that were more shell than substance. The garden that had always provided abundance now offered only a meager supplement to their dwindling stores. Their children, Thomas and Sarah, watched their parents with the quiet understanding that comes to farm children early. Thomas was 14, old enough to work alongside his father, old enough to understand that the family's survival hung in the balance. Sarah was 11, still young enough to hope for miracles, but old enough to sense that miracles might not come. They did their chores without complaint, conserved water without being asked, ate their reduced portions without comment. The drought was teaching them lessons no school could provide about sacrifice, perseverance, and the harsh realities of a life tied to the land. Across the region, similar struggles played out on thousands of farms and ranches. In the brush country south of San Antonio, rancher Miguel Fuentes fought to keep his cattle alive. His family had worked this land for 4 generations since his great-grandfather had received a grant from the Spanish crown. They had survived revolutions, economic depressions and droughts before, but nothing had prepared them for this. Miguel had converted an old stone tank, built by his grandfather to catch rainwater, into a distribution point for well water. Each day, he pumped water from his deepest well into the tank, then allowed the cattle to drink in shifts. It was a system born of desperation, and it was barely working. The well could not keep up with the demand. He was watching his herd shrink week by week, selling animals he had raised from calves, watching trucks carry away the living legacy of his ancestors. His wife, Carmen, managed the household with fierce efficiency. Every drop of water was used multiple times. Wash water became garden water. Kitchen scraps went to the remaining chickens. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be wasted. She had learned these lessons from her mother, who had learned them from her mother, going back to times when scarcity was the norm rather than the exception. But even her skills were being tested by a drought that seemed to have no end. The psychological toll mounted alongside the physical one. Farmers who had been proud and independent began to show signs of breaking. Some turned to drink, seeking temporary escape from worries that returned each morning with the sun. Others withdrew into silence, unable to articulate the fear and grief that consumed them. A few took more permanent escapes, their deaths ruled accidents by coroners who understood that some truths were too painful to speak aloud. The community tried to respond. Churches held special prayer services, their congregations filling the pews to ask for divine intervention. Ministers spoke of faith and endurance, of tests that would prove the faithful, of rain that would surely come to those who believed. But as the weeks passed without answer, even the most devout began to wonder if their prayers were reaching anyone. In the town of Abilene, a young reporter named James Thornton began documenting the drought for the local newspaper. He drove his battered Ford across the countryside, visiting farms and ranches, talking to people who had never before spoken to a reporter. What he found shocked him. Not just the physical devastation, though that was stark enough, But the human devastation, the way the drought was eroding not just topsoil but the very fabric of community life. He wrote stories about families leaving their land, their possessions piled into trucks and trailers, heading west toward California or north toward the industrial cities where jobs might be found. He wrote about auctions where lifetime collections of farm equipment sold for pennies on the dollar, where men watched their tools and tractors go to strangers with expressions that mixed relief and grief. He wrote about children starting at new schools in distant cities, trying to explain to classmates who had never seen a farm what it meant to lose one. His stories caught the attention of larger newspapers, and soon reporters from Dallas, Houston, and even New York were descending on West Texas to document what was being called the worst drought in the state's history. The coverage brought attention but not rain. It brought sympathy but not solutions. It made the suffering visible to the wider world while doing nothing to alleviate it. The federal government began to take notice. The Eisenhower administration, facing criticism for its response to the unfolding disaster, dispatched officials to assess the situation. What they found confirmed what the locals already knew. This was not a normal dry spell that would correct itself in a season or two. This was a systemic crisis that threatened the agricultural foundation of an entire region. Emergency programs were hastily assembled. The Farmers' Home Administration offered loans to families at risk of losing their land. The Department of Agriculture purchased surplus cattle at above-market prices to remove them from ranges that could no longer support them. Feed programs were established to help those who still had animals alive. These measures provided relief, but not rescue. They bought time without solving the underlying problem. Harold Dawson applied for an emergency loan in July. The process required him to expose his finances to government scrutiny, to admit in official documents that he could not survive on his own. It was humiliating for a man who had prided himself on independence, who had never asked for help from anyone. But he swallowed his pride because the alternative was losing everything. The loan was approved in August, providing enough capital to survive another season if the rain came. If it did not, the loan would simply add to the debts that would eventually consume the farm. As summer stretched toward autumn, the heat finally began to relent. Temperatures dropped from impossible to merely unbearable, then to something approaching normal. But the relief was illusory. The cooling air brought no clouds, no moisture, no promise of change. The drought continued as implacable as ever, waiting for the next season to inflict new damage on a land that had already given so much. The people of West Texas had always been proud of their toughness, their ability to endure conditions that would break softer folk from easier places. But the drought of 1954 was testing that toughness in ways no one had anticipated. It was not just a challenge to be overcome, but an existential threat that questioned whether human habitation of this land was ever truly sustainable. In the fading light of August evenings, farmers gathered on porches and in feed stores, speaking quietly of their fears and their hopes. They talked about the old-timers who remembered previous droughts, who offered assurance that this too would pass. They talked about the scientists who were studying the problem, who promised that new techniques might make drought-resistant farming possible. They talked about God and fate and luck, searching for explanations that might make sense of their suffering. But mostly, they talked about rain, about the smell of it, the sound of it, the way it transformed the world in a matter of hours. They talked about rain the way prisoners talk about freedom, with a longing so deep it approached physical pain. They remembered the last good rain, passed its details like precious memories, wondered if they would ever experience such joy again. The summer of 1954 left its mark on everyone who survived it, not just in practical terms, though the economic damage was severe, but in psychological and spiritual terms, in the way people understood their relationship with the land and sky, in the way they thought about the future and its uncertainties. They had learned that the natural world owed them nothing, that the bounty they had enjoyed was a gift that could be withdrawn at any moment. It was a hard lesson, and not everyone was able to absorb it without breaking. Chapter 3. Autumn came to West Texas wearing the same cruel mask as summer. The calendar said September, then October, then November, but the sky remained indifferent to human measurements of time. The mornings grew cooler, the days shorter, but the drought continued with relentless persistence, as if it had decided that this land and these people had not yet suffered enough. On the farms that had survived the summer, a new phase of the crisis began. Winter wheat should have been planted in September, the seeds tucked into moist soil to germinate before the freezes came. But the soil was not moist. It was powder. barely distinguishable from the dust that blew across the roads and settled on every surface. Farmers faced an impossible choice: plant and hope for rain that might not come, or leave the fields fallow and face certain loss of the season. Harold Dawson chose to plant. He had always planted in September, just as his father had planted and his grandfather before him. The routine of farm life provided structure, gave purpose to days that might otherwise have dissolved into despair. So he walked behind his seed drill, watching the wheat kernels disappear into the parched earth, knowing that without rain they would simply lie there, dormant and dying, until the sun baked them into uselessness. Eleanor watched him from the house, understanding the futility even as she respected the necessity. Harold needed to believe that normal actions could produce normal results, that if he just kept doing what farmers do, the universe would eventually respond in kind. It was a form of faith, perhaps the deepest form, the kind that persists not because of evidence, but despite its absence. In the weeks that followed, Harold checked his fields daily, looking for signs of germination. Sometimes he found a few green shoots pushing through the crust of dust, brave and foolish pioneers in a hostile world. More often, he found nothing but the same dead brown expanse, the seeds invisible beneath the surface, waiting for water that did not come. The cattle situation grew more desperate as the autumn progressed. The grass that should have regrown after summer never materialized. Ranchers who had held onto their herds through the summer now faced the reality that there was simply no way to feed them through the winter. The government buying program provided an outlet, but it felt less like rescue than assisted surrender. Men who had built their herds over decades watched them trucked away to slaughterhouses, knowing that even if the drought ended tomorrow, it would take years to rebuild what had been lost. George Whitfield finally sold his last cattle in late October. The check he received barely covered his outstanding debts, leaving nothing for the future. He stood at the gate of his empty corral, listening to the silence where once there had been the sounds of a living ranch. The quiet was worse than any noise could have been, a sonic representation of everything that had been taken from him. His wife, Martha, found him there as the sun set, his face wet with tears. He had been too proud to shed in front of anyone else. She took his hand without speaking, stood beside him in the gathering darkness, offering the only comfort she could. They had been married for 31 years, had built this ranch together from nothing, had raised 4 children who had scattered to cities where drought was just a word in newspapers. Now they faced an uncertain future, with nothing but each other, and a piece of land that seemed more curse than blessing. The drought was reshaping not just the economy of West Texas, but its demography. The exodus that had begun as a trickle in the summer became a flood in the fall. Families who had exhausted their resources and their options packed what they could carry and headed for places that promised opportunity. Some went to Houston, where the oil industry offered jobs to men willing to work hard. Others went to California, following the path that Dust Bowl refugees had worn smooth 2 decades earlier. Still others dispersed to smaller cities and towns across the country, wherever relatives or friends might offer a foothold for a new beginning. Those who remained watched their neighbors leave with mixed emotions. There was sorrow at the breaking of community bonds, at the emptying of schools and churches and main streets, but there was also relief, because each departure reduced the competition for whatever resources remained, and there was guilt about that relief, a recognition that survival sometimes requires a hardness of heart that troubles the conscience. In the town of Snyder, the local school district consolidated 3 elementary schools into one, the student population having dropped too low to justify separate facilities. Teachers who had spent careers in those schools were reassigned or let go. Children who had walked to neighborhood classrooms now rode buses across town, their routes passing abandoned farmhouses and untended fields that told the story of what was happening more eloquently than any words. The merchants of Snyder struggled to adapt. Hardware stores that had sold to farmers shifted their inventory toward the needs of the remaining population. Dress shops that had outfitted ranch wives for church and social occasions found their customer base evaporating. Some businesses closed entirely, their owners joining the exodus or retiring early to whatever savings they had managed to accumulate. The downtown that had bustled with activity now showed gaps. Like a smile missing teeth, the empty storefronts a visible record of economic collapse. Through all of this, the larger world continued on its way, largely indifferent to the suffering in rural Texas. The newspapers ran occasional stories, usually pegged to some dramatic milestone like a record temperature or a notable bankruptcy. Politicians made speeches about the need for relief, then returned to other concerns that seemed more pressing. The drought was a regional disaster, not a national emergency, and the mechanisms for responding to it were still being invented. James Thornton, the reporter who had been documenting the crisis since summer, found himself growing frustrated with the limitations of his medium. He could write about individual families, could put names and faces to the statistics, but he could not convey the cumulative weight of what was happening. Each story stood alone, a small tragedy among many, quickly forgotten as readers moved on to the next day's news. The magnitude of the disaster exceeded what journalism could capture. One October afternoon, Thornton visited a farm outside the town of Colorado City. The family there, the Hendersons, had decided to leave after 4 generations on the land. The father, William Henderson, walked the reporter through the empty farmhouse, pointing out features that had meant something to his family. The door frame where children's heights had been marked over the years, the window seat where his grandmother had done her sewing, the fireplace his grandfather had built with stones hauled from a distant creek. When William's voice broke during the tour, he apologized for his emotion. There was no need, Thornton told him. These feelings were appropriate, were human, were perhaps the most important part of the story. William nodded, composed himself, and continued the tour. In the kitchen, his wife Ruth was packing the last of their dishes, wrapping each one in newspaper, as if preparing for a journey from which they might someday return. They both knew that was unlikely. Once the land was sold, there would be no coming back. If this story is touching your heart, pause for a moment and leave a comment saying, "No family should have to leave behind generations of memories." Your words honor their sacrifice and connect us all in remembering what was lost. The Hendersons were just one family among thousands, their story one thread in a tapestry of loss that stretched across the entire region. But their story contained all the elements that made the drought so devastating. The deep roots that bound people to place, the economic forces that were severing those roots, the emotional toll of leaving everything familiar for everything unknown. As November progressed, the weather finally began to change, not in the way the farmers had prayed for, with soaking rains that would replenish the parched earth. Instead, the change brought cold, a reminder that winter was coming whether the land was ready for it or not. The first freeze arrived in mid-November, killing whatever vegetation had managed to survive the summer and fall. The ground that had been too dry to plant now became too frozen to work, a double barrier against any agricultural activity. The cold added new hardships to a population already stretched thin. Heating costs rose as temperatures fell, straining budgets that had no room for additional expenses. The wood that some families burned for heat was harder to find, the trees that might have provided it having died from the drought. The alternatives, coal and fuel oil, required cash that was in short supply. Harold Dawson had laid in a supply of firewood during the summer, cutting dead mesquite from a back section of his property. It would see them through the winter, he thought, though he would need to be careful about rationing. The big farmhouse his grandfather had built was drafty, designed for the mild Texas winters of the previous century, not for the extremes that seemed to be becoming more common. He stuffed rags into the gaps around windows, hung blankets over doorways, concentrated the family's living into a few rooms that could be kept warm. Eleanor made stews and soups that stretched their supplies, turned their stored vegetables into meals that filled bellies, if not hearts. The children did their schoolwork by lamplight, their breath sometimes visible in the colder corners of the house. They complained less than might have been expected, understanding instinctively that their parents were doing everything possible under impossible circumstances. The drought of 1954 was entering its 5th year, counting from the first below-normal rainfall in 1950. 5 years of accumulating damage, of reserves being depleted, of hope being eroded. 5 years that had transformed the landscape and the people who inhabited it. And there was no end in sight, no indication that the cycle was about to break, no reason for optimism, except the stubborn human refusal to accept defeat. In the small towns and scattered farmhouses of West Texas, people prepared for a winter that promised hardship without offering hope. They drew on resources both material and spiritual, reaching deep into themselves for the strength to continue. They leaned on each other, on family and neighbor and community, finding in human connection what nature was denying them. And they waited, as they had waited for years now, for the rain that would signal the drought's end and the beginning of recovery. The waiting was perhaps the hardest part. It was not like waiting for a known event, a birth or a harvest or a holiday. It was waiting without knowing if what was waited for would ever come, waiting in the face of accumulating evidence that it might not. It was a test of endurance that went beyond the physical, that challenged the very foundation of faith and hope on which human life depends. And yet they endured. Not everyone, not without cost, but enough to keep the communities alive, enough to preserve the possibility of a future. The drought was winning, but it had not won yet. The people of West Texas were bent but not broken, diminished but not destroyed. They would see this winter through, and the next, and however many more the drought demanded, until at last the sky remembered its obligations and the rain returned. Chapter 4. Winter settled over West Texas like a punishment added to punishment. The cold that arrived in November deepened in December, bringing temperatures that fell below freezing night after night, sometimes not rising above it even during the short daylight hours. The land that had baked under summer sun now cracked under winter frost, the soil contracting and expanding with the temperature swings, becoming ever more hostile to the seeds that lay buried within it. Christmas came and went with muted celebration. Families gathered as they always had, but the gatherings were smaller now, missing those who had moved away. The gifts exchanged were modest, practical things rather than luxuries. The meals were simpler than in years past, though the cooks worked hard to make them feel festive. There was determination in these celebrations, a refusal to let the drought steal this too, but there was also an undertone of sadness that no amount of carols or decorations could quite dispel. In the Dawson household, Eleanor had saved all year to buy fabric for new Christmas dresses for Sarah and a new shirt for Thomas. She stayed up late on Christmas Eve, her needle flying by lamplight, putting the final touches on garments that would have seemed ordinary in normal times, but now represented a significant sacrifice. When the children opened their packages on Christmas morning, their genuine delight made every late night worthwhile. Harold's gift to Eleanor was a repaired set of her mother's china, pieces that had been broken in a move years earlier and carefully stored in hopes of eventual restoration. He had taken them to a shop in Lubbock during a supply run in October, had paid for the repair with money he could not really spare, had hidden them in the barn until Christmas morning. When Eleanor unwrapped the restored dishes, she wept openly, the tears representing more than gratitude for a gift. They were tears for everything the drought had taken and everything that remained, for the past that the china represented and the uncertain future that lay ahead. The new year of 1955 brought no immediate change in the weather pattern. January was cold and dry, February colder and drier. The forecasters who studied such things spoke of high-pressure systems that blocked moisture from entering the region, of atmospheric patterns that showed no signs of shifting. The technical explanations meant little to farmers who simply knew that the rain was not coming, that another planting season was approaching, without the conditions necessary for success. In the state capital at Austin, legislators debated what more could be done. The emergency programs established in 1954 had provided relief, but not solution. New proposals emerged: bond issues to fund water projects, tax incentives to encourage conservation, research programs to develop drought-resistant crops. The debates were earnest, the participants genuinely concerned, but the political process moved slowly, while the drought moved on, indifferent to human deliberations. Governor Allen Shivers, facing pressure from all directions, toured the drought-affected areas in February. He visited farms and ranches, met with local officials, posed for photographs with families whose lives had been upended. His expressions of sympathy seemed genuine, his promises of continued support credible, but everyone understood the limitations of what government could do. The drought was not a problem that could be solved by legislation or appropriations. It was a force of nature that would end only when nature decided, and no human authority could command the clouds. The governor's visit brought temporary attention to the crisis, a fresh wave of news coverage that reminded the rest of Texas what their western neighbors were enduring. Donations flowed to relief organizations, providing money for emergency supplies and support services. Churches in unaffected areas organized drives for clothing and food, sending truckloads of assistance to communities that desperately needed it. These gestures of solidarity meant more than their material value. They reminded the people of the drought zone that they had not been forgotten, that their fellow Texans still cared about their suffering. In a crisis that had gone on so long, the psychological support was almost as important as the physical. Isolation and despair fed on each other. The knowledge that others were watching and helping broke that cycle, at least partially. On the Fuentes Ranch south of San Antonio, Miguel received a delivery of hay from a church group in Houston. The hay would feed his remaining cattle for perhaps 2 weeks, a small thing in the scope of the crisis, but enormous in its immediate impact. More than the hay itself, Miguel valued the letter that came with it, written by children in the church's Sunday school, expressing their hope that the rain would come soon and that the animals would be okay. He posted the letter on his kitchen wall, where he could see it every morning, a small beacon of hope in a landscape of despair. The winter wore on, each day much like the one before. People fell into routines of survival, doing what needed to be done with diminishing expectation of reward. The farmers who had planted winter wheat watched their fields, seeing little evidence of the germination that should have occurred months ago. The ranchers who still had cattle rationed their dwindling hay supplies, calculating how long they could hold on. The townspeople who depended on agricultural commerce watched their businesses slowly wither. Mental health became an increasingly pressing concern. The isolation of rural life, always a factor, was intensified by the drought's demands. Farm families who might have socialized with neighbors had no time or energy for visiting. The gatherings that had punctuated rural life, the church suppers and community events and casual drop-ins, became less frequent as people retreated into their private struggles. Some men drank more than they should. Some women developed symptoms of what would later be called depression. Children grew up too fast, burdened with responsibilities and worries that should have been reserved for adults. The churches tried to help, their pastors making rounds of visits to check on members, their congregations organizing what social activities they could manage, but the pastors were overwhelmed, stretched thin across parishes that covered huge geographic areas, unable to provide the sustained attention that some families needed. And the religious consolations they offered, the assurances that God had a plan, that suffering had purpose, that faith would be rewarded, rang hollow in the ears of people who had been faithful for years without relief. In late February, a storm system moved toward Texas from the Pacific. The forecasters tracked it with interest, noting that it carried significant moisture and was following a path that might bring it over the drought-stricken areas. For a few days, hope flickered. People scanned the western horizon, watching for the clouds that might herald the end of their long ordeal. They checked the forecasts obsessively, parsed the meteorological data, allowed themselves to imagine what life might be like if rain finally came. The storm arrived on the last day of February. It brought clouds that covered the sky, that turned the world gray and heavy with moisture. It brought drops of rain that spotted the dust, that raised the smell of wet earth for the first time in months. People ran outside to feel the water on their faces, lifted their hands to the sky, wept with relief and gratitude. But the rain did not last. The storm weakened as it crossed the region, dropping less than a quarter inch before moving on. It was enough to tease but not to transform, enough to remind everyone what they were missing, but not enough to satisfy their need. The drought had survived another challenge, had demonstrated once again that it would not be easily defeated. The disappointment was profound. People who had carefully managed their emotions, who had protected themselves from hope precisely to avoid this kind of letdown, found themselves devastated anyway. The brief rain had cracked their defenses, had allowed yearning to flood in, and now they were left with that yearning unsatisfied. Some said it would have been better if the storm had not come at all, if the drought had continued uninterrupted rather than offering false promise. Others disagreed, arguing that any rain was better than none, that even a temporary reprieve had value. March came, and with it the official start of spring. The seasonal change brought warmer temperatures but no moisture. The land that should have been greening with new growth remained brown and bare. The fruit trees that had survived the previous year's punishment put out tentative blossoms, then dropped them as the drought stress overwhelmed their reproductive efforts. The wildflowers that normally carpeted the Texas countryside in spring were absent, their seeds lying dormant in soil too dry for germination. The planting season for cotton and other summer crops approached, forcing farmers to make decisions they had hoped to avoid. Plant now and risk losing everything if the rain did not come. Wait for rain and risk missing the optimal planting window. There were no good options, only choices among varying degrees of bad. Each family made its own calculation, weighing its resources, its debts, its tolerance for risk, its fundamental optimism or pessimism about what the future might bring. Harold Dawson decided to plant half his usual cotton acreage. It was a compromise, a hedge against both hope and despair. If the rain came, he would harvest something, even if not a full crop. If it did not, he would lose less than if he had planted everything. The seed cost him money he barely had, but doing nothing felt like surrender, and he was not ready to surrender yet. Across the region, thousands of other farmers made similar calculations, reaching similar compromises. The spring planting of 1955 was an act of qualified faith, a bet placed by people who could not afford to bet but could not afford not to. They put their seeds in the ground and resumed their waiting, watching the sky, parsing every forecast, hoping for the miracle that had so far failed to materialize. The drought had now lasted more than 5 years, making it among the longest in Texas history. The cumulative damage was almost beyond calculation. Billions of dollars in agricultural losses, hundreds of thousands of people displaced, entire communities transformed beyond recognition, environmental damage that would take decades to repair, if it could be repaired at all. And still it continued, implacable and seemingly endless, a biblical-scale disaster unfolding in modern America. Yet the people endured. Not everyone, not without scars, but enough to matter. They had learned lessons about resilience that no textbook could teach. They had discovered resources within themselves and their communities that they had not known existed. They had faced the worst that nature could offer and, though battered, had not been defeated. The drought would eventually end, as all droughts do. When it did, these people, or their descendants, would still be here, ready to rebuild what had been destroyed and begin again. Chapter 5. The spring of 1955 brought false starts and dashed hopes, a pattern that had become cruelly familiar. Storms would appear on the horizon, their dark clouds promising relief, only to veer away at the last moment or dissipate before dropping significant moisture. The people of West Texas learned to guard their expectations, to watch approaching weather with skepticism rather than excitement, to trust nothing until the rain was actually falling on their land. April came and went without meaningful precipitation. The cotton that Harold Dawson had planted struggled in the parched soil, some seeds never germinating at all, others producing seedlings too weak to survive. He replanted twice, using the last of his seed reserves, achieving only marginal improvement. By the end of the month, it was clear that even if rain came soon, his harvest would be far below what he needed to meet his obligations. The federal government increased its emergency programs, responding to reports that the drought might extend into a 6th year. The Farmers' Home Administration loosened its lending criteria, making loans available to families who had previously been deemed too risky. The Agricultural Conservation Program offered payments to farmers who left land fallow rather than planting doomed crops. These measures helped some families survive, but they were band-aids on wounds that required surgery. In the ranch country, the livestock reduction continued. Herds that had once numbered in the thousands were now counted in dozens. The great ranches of West Texas, symbols of the state's identity and pride, looked increasingly like ghost operations, their pastures empty, their infrastructure deteriorating, their owners struggling to maintain even the semblance of viable enterprises. George Whitfield, who had sold his last cattle the previous fall, now worked part-time at a feed store in Sweetwater. The income was modest, barely enough to cover his reduced living expenses, but it gave him a reason to get out of bed each morning. His wife Martha took in sewing, using skills her mother had taught her decades ago. Together they scraped by, waiting for conditions that would allow them to rebuild their ranching operation, not certain that those conditions would ever arrive. Their situation was representative of thousands of others. The drought had created a new class in rural Texas, former farmers and ranchers who had been forced into wage labor, but who still considered the land their true vocation. They worked at jobs they had never expected to hold, lived in circumstances they had never imagined, maintained hopes they could not always justify. They were economic refugees who had not yet left home, displaced persons still inhabiting the places where they had once prospered. In late April, a series of storms finally brought significant rain to parts of the drought zone. Not to all of it, not evenly, but enough in some areas to make a difference. The rain fell for 3 days, soaking into soil that had been thirsty for so long that it seemed to drink without limit. Creeks that had been dry for years began to flow again. Stock tanks that had shrunk to muddy depressions filled with water that reflected the grey sky above. The celebration was tempered by awareness that the crisis was far from over. 3 days of rain, however welcome, could not undo 5 years of damage. The water table that had dropped hundreds of feet would not recover in a week. The topsoil that had blown away to other states would not reconstitute itself overnight. The economic structures that had collapsed would need years of favorable conditions to rebuild. But for the first time in what felt like forever, there was genuine hope that the worst might be past. Harold Dawson walked his fields after the rain stopped, feeling the mud squish under his boots, marveling at a sensation he had almost forgotten. The cotton plants that had been struggling now straightened perceptibly, their leaves uncurling, their colors deepening from sickly yellow-green to something approaching healthy verdant. It was too soon to know if they would survive, too soon to predict a harvest, but it was not too soon to feel something other than despair. Eleanor joined him in the field, something she had rarely done during the drought years. She had kept to the house and garden, conserving her energy for the battles she could influence, leaving the larger landscape to her husband. But today she wanted to see for herself, wanted to feel the wet earth, wanted to share the moment with the man she had married and suffered alongside for 2 decades. They stood together in silence, looking out over the land they loved, the land that had nearly broken them. Thomas and Sarah were at school, continuing their education, despite everything, preparing for futures that might take them far from this place. The farm might survive or might not. The family would survive regardless. That was what the drought had taught them most clearly, that they were more than their land, more than their livestock, more than their crops. They were people with the capacity to endure, to adapt, to begin again if necessary. May brought more rain, not abundant but adequate, enough to sustain the crops that had survived the spring and to encourage growth in those that had been stunted. The forecasters began to speak cautiously of a changing pattern, of atmospheric conditions that might favor continued precipitation. They were careful not to promise too much, having been wrong before, but their tone was more optimistic than it had been in years. The rains continued into June, then July, then August. Not every day, not everywhere, but with a regularity that began to feel normal rather than miraculous. Lakes that had been low for years started to refill. Rivers that had dwindled to trickles resumed their flows. The grass came back, not lush but present, offering grazing to cattle that had survived the culling. By the end of summer, it was clear that the drought was breaking. Not ended, not defeated in some dramatic climax, but simply fading, yielding to a new pattern that favored moisture over aridity. The people who had endured so long allowed themselves to believe that the worst was truly over, that the years ahead would be better than the years behind. The recovery would take longer than the drought itself. Farms that had been bankrupted would not spring back to life just because rain had returned. Ranchers who had sold their breeding stock would need years to rebuild their herds. Communities that had lost half their population would not quickly regain their former vitality. The scars of the drought were carved deep into the land and the people, and healing would be a generational project. But the healing began. Farmers who had been contemplating surrender instead began planning for the future. Ranchers started acquiring new cattle, a few animals at a time, rebuilding the herds their families had maintained for generations. Towns that had seemed destined for abandonment found reasons for cautious optimism. The exodus slowed, then stopped, then began modestly to reverse as some who had left discovered that opportunity elsewhere was not what they had hoped. Harold Dawson harvested a cotton crop in the fall of 1955. It was far from a record yield, barely enough to cover his operating costs after the debts were paid, but it was a harvest nonetheless. He stood at the gin watching his cotton processed, remembering the years when no harvest had seemed possible, grateful for what now existed. The loan from the Farmers' Home Administration would be paid back eventually, though it took several more years of decent harvests to retire it. The farm that had been at risk of foreclosure remained in the Dawson family, passing eventually to Thomas, who worked it until his own retirement, then to Thomas's son, who worked it still. The continuity that had seemed impossible in the depths of the drought was maintained. The generations connected through the land they shared. George and Martha Whitfield never fully rebuilt their ranching operation. They were too old, too tired, too marked by the experience to start over at the scale they had known. But they kept a small herd, enough to feel like ranchers again, enough to pass on to their son what remained of the family's ranching heritage. It was less than they had hoped for when they married, less than they had expected through most of their lives, but it was something, and something was better than nothing. The drought of 1950 to 1956, as it came to be called, entered the history books as one of the defining events of 20th century Texas. It became a reference point for understanding rural resilience, a case study for agricultural policy, a story told by grandparents to grandchildren as a reminder of what their family had survived. The memories softened over time, the sharpest edges of suffering wearing smooth, but the essence remained. A reminder that the land gives and takes, that prosperity is never guaranteed, that survival requires both effort and grace. Chapter 6. Years later, when the drought had receded into memory, the survivors looked back with a mixture of pride and pain. They had endured something that would have broken many people, had maintained their communities and their identities through an ordeal that had seemed endless. They had learned lessons about themselves and each other that could not have been learned any other way. The landscape recovered, though not entirely to what it had been. Some changes wrought by the drought proved permanent, subtle alterations in vegetation patterns and soil composition that would persist for generations. But the casual observer driving through West Texas in the years after the drought would see a land that looked normal, prosperous, blessed with the moisture that makes agriculture possible. Only those who knew what to look for could detect the scars beneath the surface. The people who had lived through the drought carried their own invisible scars. Some manifested as behaviors that puzzled their children and grandchildren: the compulsive saving of water, the reluctance to throw away anything that might someday be useful, the wariness about weather and forecasts, and the reliability of nature. These habits seemed excessive to generations who had never known real scarcity, who could not understand what it meant to face the loss of everything. Others carried their scars in their stories, tales they told at family gatherings and community events, narratives that grew smoother with each retelling, but never lost their essential truth. They spoke of the dust and the heat, the dying cattle and the failing crops, the neighbors who left and the neighbors who stayed. They spoke of the hard decisions and the harder consequences, the faith that sustained some and the doubt that afflicted others. They spoke so that the experience would not be lost, so that future generations would know what their ancestors had faced and overcome. Harold Dawson lived to see his grandchildren, lived to walk the fields with them and tell them about the years when no rain fell. He showed them the places where the soil had been worst eroded, the windmill that had pumped from a well that had nearly gone dry, the marks on the barn door where he had recorded each season's rainfall, the line of zeros from the drought years stark against the blessed numbers that came after. He told them about their grandmother, about how she had held the family together when it would have been easy to fall apart, about the dresses she had sewn for Christmas, the china she had wept over, the countless small acts of love and determination that had made survival possible. Eleanor had passed away a few years before, peacefully, surrounded by the family she had helped create and sustain. Harold spoke of her with a tenderness that made his grandchildren understand what love could mean over a lifetime of trials. He told them about the community, about the neighbors who had shared what little they had, the churches that had organized relief, the strangers who had sent help from distant cities. The drought had revealed human nature in its fullness, the capacity for both selfishness and generosity, the way crisis could bring out the best and worst in people. Harold chose to emphasize the best, to remember the acts of kindness rather than the moments of meanness, to tell a story of collective triumph over adversity. In the towns that had survived the drought, monuments and memorials eventually appeared. Some were formal bronze plaques and stone markers that commemorated the Great Drought of 1950-1956 and honored those who had endured it. Others were informal, the stories passed down in families, the habits preserved across generations, the deep respect for water and land that became part of the regional character. The agricultural practices changed as well, influenced by the hard lessons of the drought. Farmers adopted conservation techniques that reduced soil erosion and preserved moisture. Ranchers learned to manage their herds with greater attention to carrying capacity, avoiding the overstocking that had worsened the drought's impact. Water districts were formed to regulate groundwater pumping, protecting the aquifers from the uncontrolled exploitation that had contributed to the crisis. These changes represented a new relationship between humans and the land, one based on respect rather than dominance, on sustainability rather than extraction. The drought had been a teacher, harsh but effective, and its lessons shaped policy and practice for generations to come. The cycle of drought would return, as it always does in semi-arid lands. Other droughts in subsequent decades would test new generations of Texans, would force new adaptations, and require new forms of resilience. But each of those droughts would be faced by a population that knew, because their ancestors had told them, that such things could be survived. The knowledge itself was a form of inheritance, passed down like land and livestock, a resource as valuable as any material asset. In the end, what the drought of 1954 taught was not simply about agriculture or economics or meteorology. It was about human nature, about the depths from which people can draw when circumstances demand it, about the bonds that hold communities together under pressure. It was about faith, Not just religious faith, but faith in the future, faith in each other, faith in the fundamental possibility of renewal and recovery. The land that had nearly broken Harold Dawson, and so many others remained. It endured, as it had endured for millions of years before any human walked its surface, as it would endure for millions more after the last human was gone. The drought was a moment in geological time, barely a blink, though it had seemed like forever to those who lived through it. The land did not hold grudges or remember suffering. It simply was, offering its challenges and its blessings with equal indifference, waiting for whatever next chapter humans might write upon its surface. And the people remained too, those who had survived and their descendants, bound to the land by ties of history and choice and love. They would face new challenges in new times, would adapt as their ancestors had adapted, would find within themselves resources they did not know they possessed. The drought had not broken them, nothing would. The rains returned, as rains always eventually return. The earth greened, the cattle fattened, the crops grew tall under skies that had finally remembered their ancient compact with the land. Life went on as life always goes on, shaped by what had been and shaped by hope for what would be. The story of the drought became part of the larger story of Texas, a chapter of darkness that made the subsequent light more brilliant, a season of suffering that made the eventual joy more profound. If you watched this far, it's because this story touched something deep in your heart. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end, so I can know who you are and understand who truly values these stories of human resilience." Your presence here matters. This is the beating heart of what rural Texas endured. The story of families like the Dawsons and the Whitfields, the communities like Snyder and Sweetwater, the land that tested its people and found them worthy. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, shared, and honored. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who would appreciate knowing what the people of Texas overcame. And if you have not already subscribed to this channel, please do so now to join a community dedicated to preserving these essential stories of human courage and endurance. The drought is over, but its lessons remain, written in the land and in the hearts of all who remember. Until the next story, thank you for being part of this journey into history and humanity.